Welcome to the strange and mysterious world of terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, Penny Dreadful, becoming possessed by Danielle. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am super excited to be joined by Stuart Manning and Eric Wallace, the co-writers of Kingdom of the Dead, the 4-part Big Finish audio drama that they created, and they're going to be discussing that with me today. But before we get to the show, there are a few things I want to tell you about. If you jump on over to YouTube and watch the video version of this episode, it is loaded with tons of photos that were kindly sent to me by Stuart. The photos feature the Big Finish Dark Shadows cast and crew recording Kingdom of the Dead. There are a couple of pictures in there too from other audio dramas like London's Burning and The Night Whispers, but for the most part it's Kingdom of the Dead, and the pictures were taken by Eric Wallace, Darren Gross, and Stuart Manning. So thank you so much, Stuart, for sending those pictures along. They are fantastic. If you want to see David Selby, Lara Parker, Kathryn Leigh Scott, Alec Newman, Lysette Anthony, Jerry Lacy, John Karlen, James Storm, Andrew Collins, David Warner, etc. in action recording Kingdom of the Dead, jump on over to YouTube and you can check out those photos. Speaking of photos, I received a great photo from my friend Guy Haynes, who was wearing a Terror at Collinwood t-shirt as he celebrated his birthday. You can see that over on the YouTube version as well. Thank you so much, Guy, for getting a t-shirt and for sending your photo in. And if you want to send your photo in of you wearing a Terror at Collinwood t-shirt, send it on over to terroratcollinwood@gmail.com, and I will include it in a future episode of the podcast in a video version. And yes, you can get your very own Terror at Collinwood t-shirt at the Terror at Collinwood TeePublic shop. The shirts are available in many somber colors. If you hop on over to teepublic.com/user/Penny Dreadful Roman numeral 13 XIII, I'll put a link in the show notes. The shirts are often on sale. In fact, they are currently on sale as of this recording for 35% off. So you can get your shirts just in time for Halloween. And speaking of Halloween, I am going to be doing a live hosting event as Penny Dreadful. I'm going to be introducing Roger Corman's 1963 picture, The Raven, at the Luna Theater in Lowell, Massachusetts, and that is going to be happening on Sunday, October 20th at 2 p.m. If you've never seen The Raven and you're in the area, this is a great opportunity to catch the movie. It stars Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, Boris Karloff, Hazel Court, and a young Jack Nicholson. It's directed by Roger Corman, written by Richard Matheson. It is a horror comedy based on the Edgar Allan Poe poem, What Is Not to Love? So come on down. I'm going to be hosting that. I'm going to be holding a contest as well, giving away some merch. It's going to be a good time. A quick follow-up to the questions and answers episode I posted. Cosmo13 over on the Classic Horror Film Board pointed out something that I thought was quite interesting here. And I never did the math on this. I never crunched the numbers, but Cosmo did. And he says that the idea that Chris and Tom Jennings are twins seems to have become entrenched in Dark Shadows fandom. But there's nothing in any of the episodes to corroborate that idea. Instead, Dark Shadows establishes Chris as several years older than Tom. When Chris tells Barnabas that his first transformation into a werewolf occurred 7 years ago, just days past my 21st birthday, that indicates Chris was born in 1940 or 1941. Tom Jennings' grave marker establishes his year of birth as 1944. So yes, the reason Chris inherited the werewolf curse, but Tom didn't, is that Chris is older than Tom, but not just a few seconds or a few minutes older, but 3 or 4 years older. Some fans may believe that Chris and Tom are twins because they look alike and are played by the same actor in the same time period. By that reasoning, Sebastian Shaw and Jabez Hawkes must also be twins, or Dirk Wilkins and Charles Delaware Tate, or Ben Stokes and Mordecai Grimes, or ... So very interesting here, Cosmo13. Thank you for posting that. My thought was always that they were twins and Chris was born a little before Tom, just because the way Joe Haskell in his dream sequence reacts to Tom, and Tom says, "You never could tell us apart." But yeah, you're right. And I did look this up, and this can happen where siblings can look almost exactly alike. They're like carbon copy siblings, they call it, I believe. And they can look very much alike. So it seems like that's the case here. That said, the gravestone dates on Dark Shadows are often incorrect. I think there's a supernatural explanation for that. And there's some weird timey-wimey stuff happening with all the time travel and parallel universes, etc., that is affecting the dates that become sort of malleable in the town of Collinsport, that these dates seem to shift and change. But I like this here because it came right out of the show and it's an answer to the situation. But even if they had been twins, one of them's born first before the other, so it still works. But this gives more of a definitive in-show answer that Chris is actually a few years older than Tom and that they just look a whole lot alike. But thank you again for posting that, Cosmo13. And if you have never been to the Classic Horror Film Board, folks, you got to check it out. It is a wonderful, long-running fan community website. Dark Shadows is certainly discussed there, absolutely, but so is every classic horror topic under the full moon. Definitely head on over to the Classic Horror Film Board. And last but not least, before we get to the credits, I want to thank Kathryn Gonzalez for sending me this really cool promo. I played one of her promos in an earlier episode, and this one is fantastic too. So let's get to the promo and the credits, and then we'll get to the show. Thank you again, Kathryn, for sending that to me.
Welcome home, cousin. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood, a Dark Shadows podcast, hosted by Rondo Award-winning TV horror hostess, Penny Dreadful.
There's nowhere to run, there's no place to hide. This podcast is fun, but there are spoilers inside. I'm very excited to be joined today by my two guests, Eric Wallace and Stuart Manning. Eric Wallace is the 2021 recipient of the special Saturn Award known as the Dan Curtis Legacy Award. Eric is a screenwriter, comics writer, and producer, having been a showrunner and executive producer on CW's very popular series, The Flash. Prior to this, Eric enjoyed a 5-year run on the Sci-Fi Channel's hit show Eureka. This was followed by a string of successes which included Z Nation and Teen Wolf. Eric also wrote the Dark Shadows audio dramas The Wicked and the Dead and The Lucifer Gambit, and co-wrote the 4-part audio drama Kingdom of the Dead with my other guest today, Stuart Manning. You heard Stuart back in episodes 22, 69, and 90 of the podcast. He's a graphic designer, writer, and audio producer who worked extensively on the Dark Shadows Big Finish audio dramas, including The House of Despair, The Night Whispers, and the aforementioned Kingdom of the Dead, which he co-wrote with Eric. Stuart designed the CD covers for several Big Finish Doctor Who audio stories. He was also the art editor of Doctor Who magazine from 2007 up until July 2008. Stuart also worked on the Dark Shadows Dynamite comics early on and was the editor and publisher of the Dark Shadows Journal fanzine, runs the Dark Shadows news page on social media, and is the mastermind behind the Daytime Gothic fanzine. Welcome to the show, guys.
Hello.
Hello. I was just like, is there anything you didn't do there, Stuart?
Well, actually, that's the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more I could have said. I had
know,
to whittle
he's
that
a busy man.
No slouch.
So Stuart, I know you're getting over a cold, but you sound great. Your voice sounds good. How are you feeling?
Yeah, no, I'm interested to talk about this. It's been a long time.
Yeah. And Eric, how about you? How are you doing?
I'm good. It's funny when you first suggested this discussion, I realized I hadn't listened to Kingdom of the Dead in about 10 years. And I'm like, oops, I better brush up on that. So I did actually listen to it
Uh-huh.
for the first time in 10 years, and I was pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, it still holds up. I re-listened to I hadn't listened to it since it first came out, and I remember loving it at the time, and I listened to it again, and I still love it. So I look forward to talking about it. But before we get to that, I want to ask you about when I was at the Dark Shadows Remembrance weekend, I had the opportunity to sit down with Stuart and chat with him about his thoughts with regard to that event. What about you, Eric? What did you think of the Dark Shadows Remembrance weekend?
I thought it was terrific. I hadn't been to any kind of Dark Shadows related event in quite a while, at least 5 years, perhaps even more. And it felt like almost a homecoming of old friends, I guess. I ran into some people that I hadn't seen in a really long time. That's always great. I was sitting next to Kathleen Reich, whose
cool.
magazine I had been reading since the 80s and had that was like the Bible for me as a fan in the 80s. I didn't know anything else. I didn't know where to get the information and the concordances that she was a part of and all this good stuff. So it was a really great time. And I got to kind of reconnect with Dark Shadows, not just the fandom, but also the love of the show and whatnot. So it was really great. It was a very emotional weekend. So I had a great time. And plus I got to catch up with Stuart in person. Oh my God, that's happened twice in the last 10 years. So yeah, that's always like a special event.
Yeah, Stuart, in now it's been a few months since then. Any thoughts upon reflection with regard to the Dark Shadows Remembrance weekend? Was it worth the flight out?
Oh yeah, for sure. No, it was wonderful. I had a great time. It was, yeah, I second everything Eric said. I think it was, yeah, it was like a homecoming.
Yeah.
Very strange. Very, very strange. Everything's changed. Nothing's changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I hope to see more of those kinds of things, and of course, the Dark Shadows cast members are doing assorted appearances coming up. Kathryn Leigh Scott and Kate Jackson are both going to be appearing at Chiller, which is pretty exciting. That's a
Wow.
huge convention, and they're both going to be there. Hopefully, they're not sure yet if they're going to be sitting together, but that would be pretty cool if they are. And then in Tarrytown, they're doing the East Coast. Jonathan Frid Centenary and Sharon Smith Lentz, Donna Wandry, and Marie Wallace are all going to be there. So that'll be exciting for on the East Coast. There are a couple of things coming up, and then I know in June the Monster Bash convention. Kathryn Leigh Scott and Sharon Smith Lentz are both going to be at that convention. So the Dark Shadows cast are definitely doing appearances at these shows, but it'd be nice to have another sort of concentrated event that's focused specifically on Dark Shadows. I think that'd be really cool.
Well, the 60th's not too far away.
Exactly.
Well, that's true. Yes.
Yeah,
That just now hit me. Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
Whew.
Yeah, isn't that nuts?
It's nuts.
Yeah.
I remember the 40th like it was yesterday. What happened? Where'd the last 20 years go?
Yeah. Before we were recording, we were just talking about the Dark Shadows Files magazines, and I remember getting the 20th anniversary edition of the 20th Dark Shadows Files magazine, and that's when, of course, when Kathryn Leigh Scott started My Scrapbook Memories came out, and that just seems time flies. Eric, also, I've had Stuart on a couple of times, and he talked about his history with Dark Shadows, but I haven't had the pleasure of hearing your Dark Shadows story. So how did you discover Dark Shadows? How did you get into it? And would you say it's had any kind of impact on you creatively?
I'll answer in reverse.
Okay.
Yes, huge influence on me. To an embarrassing degree, probably, because it's just I learned how to write dialogue by listening to Dark Shadows on cassette tapes, right? So, which to answer your first question, I really discovered Dark Shadows through Famous Monsters magazine and seeing advertisements for the Dark Shadows novels or for the Barnabas Collins Kane, and he would be on the cover, and I'm like, oh, this guy, look at this, a vampire, a TV show, a soap opera. This sounds amazing. How can I watch this? And I couldn't find it anywhere, and I'd heard of it, and I know older siblings had talked about watching it. So when I was a teenager, I was living in New Orleans, and WYES started playing reruns of it finally, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to catch it from the beginning being episode 210, obviously not the first episode. And so I sat down, and they showed it every night, weeknights at 10 p.m. I'm like, this is great. All right, I'll finish my homework or whatever and sit down and watch one of these. And I watched the first one and was hooked immediately. And the black and white episodes, I think Stuart and I were talking about this. I was talking about either Stuart or Ansel, I don't remember what it was, at the convention. And we were talking about how much we loved the black and white early Barnabas episodes and how Jonathan's performance in some ways was never better. Obviously, there are greater moments and whatnot. Some of my favorite moments are later on, like in 1840 or 1897, but there's something magical happening in those first black and white episodes. And so I just gobbled them up. And when it changed into color, I almost had a heart attack. I couldn't believe it. Oh my God, Maggie's walking into the blue whale and it's in color. What's happening here? And then I watched it for I guess a year or so. And then in the second year of watching it, which would be 68, summer of 68, it was after Dream Curse and Adam and Eve. But right before Angelique turns into a vampire, I moved. I no longer had access to Dark Shadows because the place I moved to didn't show it. And I was having withdrawal, and a friend of mine started recording the episodes on audio cassettes and sent them to me. And it was just as I was starting to get into screenwriting as a young person. And so I would listen to these audio cassettes over and over and over. And these episodes I hadn't seen. I didn't see these episodes until several years later, but I knew all the dialogue. And so I had to imagine what a new set might look like. If a new character walked in, I had no idea. There was no internet to Google it or anything. I had to just kind of wing it. But I started listening to these audio cassettes so much and getting the rhythm of speech and the rhythm of the characters and the individual nature of voices of different characters. And when I started to write, that's what I fell back on. I said, well, Barnabas sounds different in the language that he uses from Julia, from Reverend Trask, from Quentin, from Jeff Clark. And it was just this invaluable tool. I had no idea how invaluable it was until many years later. And that's really what I kind of attribute my ear for dialogue as being trained. It was trained by Dark Shadow early on. So I owe it a huge debt.
No, I was a big fan of The Flash. I watched quite a bit of that when that was on the CW. And you've worked on so many other things. Have you ever dropped a Dark Shadows nod or reference into any of these things?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I think the most blatant one, I did an episode of Ben 10 Omniverse.
Yes.
I don't know if people have seen it.
I have, yeah.
But literally, I put every Dark Shadows reference possible, even describing the alien monster of the week as having 4 strands of hair and a collar. And I'm not thinking they would ever do it. If you watch this episode, I wrote 2 Ben 10 Omniverses, but if you watch the first one, it's literally Jonathan Frid. It's literally Barnabas Collins.
It's the only episode of Ben 10 I've ever watched. It was amazing. Dead on. Was Thaddeus Collins, I think the character's name?
I think so. I haven't watched it in 10 years either.
Yeah, but, that's Barnabas, and lots of Dark Shadows references in that, for sure.
Yes, that was very enjoyable. I've probably snuck more Doctor Who references into The Flash than Dark Shadows simply because it's a more sci-fi oriented show.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so you two were collaborators on Kingdom of the Dead, which was a 4-part audio drama from 2010. It was directed by the illustrious Darren Gross, who many fans know as he was spearheading the restoration of Night of Dark Shadows, which I've seen Ansel posting a couple of comments that it's closer than it's ever been, folks, the restoration of Night of Dark Shadows. So keep your eyes out for announcements on that. Hopefully, fingers crossed. It was written by the two of you, and it's an example of a Big Finish audio drama that I really loved. I felt like it really captured the vibe of Dark Shadows for me. I have a lot of times with licensed Dark Shadows media, over the years since the original, stuff from the Ross novels and the Gold Key comics all the way to the present. Well, I feel it's kind of a very difficult vibe to capture, and I feel like you guys really captured it in this audio drama. So I want to hear about how you worked together on this. Like how did this come together? This was following up on the original, which I also enjoyed, with the ghost ship and Oswald Gravener and all of the revenant who drags Barnabas and Quentin down into the depths. And I thought that was really cool. So this kind of follows up from that. So how did this kind of come together, Kingdom of the Dead?
I suppose it's interesting what you say about the vibe or the mood or whatever you want to call it, because I think I would agree with that. I think with Dark Shadows, it's a very specific flavor, and it's not like a lot of licensed properties where you can pin it down to something narrative or a character. It's very much a sort of, as I came to realize when we did that first series, I think it's about a rhythm and an ambience and energy, and all of that stuff's really challenging to try and communicate as an artistic vision, if that doesn't sound too pretentious, to try and brief writers and get them to understand it, because it's not like you can sort of do a bullet point list of things Barnabas does and that makes it Dark Shadowsy. If you do that, you're just sort of rehashing old bits of episodes and gluing them together. So coming out of that first series, and the first series, for lots of logistical reasons, was all done as one big block in a week. It was put together very quickly. And I think it's fair to say, with no disrespect to anyone involved, that the teething troubles you might have had across an opening episode were instead across 4, which wasn't ideal. But coming out of that, I took quite a lot of time to really interrogate what we could do to make it feel more like Dark Shadows. And really, for me, it kept coming back to, how do you make this feel like a soap opera? Because we were doing hour-long stories in a Big Finish format, which was how Big Finish did all their other properties, none of which are soaps. So what you had was a Dark Shadows story to tell in an hour. I came to believe, for where full cast was concerned, really just doesn't work. Because what sort of happens is you can really only tell one story. Bear in mind, you've got quite a lot of actors, a limited budget with which you can engage them with. And so what that tended to mean was, if we were doing them as standalones, you've got four members of the cast, 2 or 3 add-ons, day players, I guess you'd call them, and one of whom has to be the villain. And in an hour-long story, they arrive in the first 20 minutes and act a bit suspicious, even though they've got to be the antagonist because no one else has turned up. They can kind of strut their stuff and be a bit villainous in the second 20 minutes, and then the third 20 minutes, they have to kind of be put back in their box and disposed of. And that's a perfectly acceptable way to tell a story within those narrative constraints. But clearly, if we were going to do a second series, that well was going to run very dry, or that joke was going to get very old. So the feeling I had was that we needed to tell a longer story was the way to go. And logistically, again, that first series, what we did, we booked the act pretty much, with the exception of a couple of scenes that were done out of order. Everyone was there on the day. We recorded it all from beginning to end in order. And that's a much more leisurely, we're still recording fast. An hour in a day is still a lot. But it's a fairly straightforward, linear way that's not too taxing. And sort of what I worked out was, if you took our cast budget and you looked at, well, we can afford 4 Dark Shadows actors a day, they don't need to be the same on all 4 of those days. If you're not, so long as you're recording an hour of material, what particular scenes that hour ended up being carved up onto which discs needn't be the same ones. And this was a bit of horse trading and kind of feeling our way. But ultimately, it was can we get more of the cast in? Can we make it bigger? To do that, therefore, it needed to be one story. So therefore, it needed to be a box set, and it needed to all come out at once. And all of those things really, all of that really led the creative side from my point of view. So those were the initial things that were all sort of sketched in. And I guess creatively, in terms of actual story, I think I'd had the idea about the angel, so, some sort of angel stroke, angelic figure who's going to come to Collinsport and would be a danger, would be our sort of big bad. Windcliff was there, and the idea there would be some kind of, nefarious thing going on, and it was sort of, I think, going to be Karlen at this point. And the other thing was Trask was going to arrive as an old man and be reborn into our sort of witchfinder general kind of character. But really, beyond that, everything was up for grabs when Eric came along, and there was, that's real. It's like half a page, so it's not really a format for a series. So there was a lot of work to do.
How did you get involved in this, Eric, in terms of collaborating with Stuart on doing this?
I think it's because I'd finished Wicked and the Dead first, and I guess he must have liked what I had done.
Gregory Trask and Carl Collins, the ghost of Carl Collins. Great.
Well, absolutely. Idea. And that was clearly, up to that point, was the best dramatic reading we'd done. It worked the best.
Fantastic.
And it's an interesting thing, co-writing, because I sort of knew, I couldn't write 4 of them solo. But again, the experience on the first year was we started off with 4 writers and we ended up with 3. And what the problem we sort of had with writers were, there were a lot of big Finnish people who could write audio drama but weren't necessarily indoctrinated in Dark Shadows. And there were the converse. There were a lot of creative Dark Shadows fans who couldn't necessarily assimilate a brief and write in this very specific format. And Eric, to be honest, was the first person who came along and could do both. And I guess what you're looking for, in any sort of collaboration like this is some of it's down to the personality as well. Is, can I work with this person? Do I think we're having the same conversation? We're talking about the same things. And Eric, the other thing he really had going for him, in my eyes, that was just just really exciting was he could get excited about any idea. He could run with any idea and just love it. I don't know whether he always loved them, but he could certainly give the impression of someone who did and really get on board with things. And so it felt like it would move quickly and it would come together and it would go places.
I think also the fact that you're both hardcore fans of the show and also writers that kind of channeling that passion for the show itself into the mix really helped a lot too. You can feel you guys really captured the characters really well. So I want to dive into that a little bit in terms of the characters. You mentioned the angel Seraph, who was played brilliantly by the legendary David Warner. What a cool get that was to get David Warner as the villain, and it was very much in that tradition of, Dark Shadows would often bring in that Nicholas Blair or Count Patofi or somebody like that, and he had that feel to him, and he was this the angel, sort of the angel of death. I guess I don't know where Mr. Best fits into that. I wanted to ask you on that. Like, is he? How does that connect? But so talk a little bit about Seraph and the creation of that character.
I think is what you said. I think we were looking at that kind of Count Patofi, Nicholas Blair silhouette, someone who could come and be a supernatural mover and shaker, and possibly there's certain biases playing in. We made it a man, although we had a woman as a villain in the other one, but we can get to that. But I sort of like the thing I liked about it, and possibly we didn't foreground it enough in the final story, is yes, he is a villain, but he's doing exactly the same thing Barnabas did when he arrived. He turns up, he ingratiates himself with a household and decides he quite likes this place and he's staying put. And in that respect, him and Barnabas are totally the same. So it was an odd balance and casting it. I didn't necessarily have someone in mind for it when we started. I had a sort of silhouette and a voice, and sometimes you kind of can sense, casting is like you'll know it when you see it or you hear it. And David Warner had this, this sort of rumpled kind of dignity about him. He's an immensely dignified man, but also kind of a bit twinkly and eccentric. And he really played, and the thing he did that was great, that wasn't necessarily planned, but certainly I really embraced it when it was offered, was he really thought he didn't want to play it as a villain. He just played it as someone who believed very sincerely in what they were doing and went about that with as much dignity as they could muster. And I thought that just worked so well. And he was also just a really amazing, just to direct. He was just an amazing guy. The first thing he said to me on the deck, because we did those bits in London. So I oversaw those bits, and the first thing he said, this is sort of the thing that's verboten if you're directing actors, is to give them a line reading or tell them how to do it. And literally the first thing he said, I said, hi, David. Oh, darling, if you want to give me a line reading, just go ahead. Just tell me what you want. And he was just, he had no ego about it, but he was just great.
That's fantastic.
So that's what I miss about not being in London, because you were at the London sessions. I was in the LA sessions with the LA cast. So I didn't get to meet Lysette Anthony or David Warner or Alec Newman.
But you got to be in the sessions with John Karlen, right? And Kathryn Leigh Scott. That must have been really cool. So
Yes. Listening to all them in between takes tell their stories about making the show in a way that I'd never heard at a convention before. This was much more off the cuff. This was much more, remember that day we all ordered Mexican and then the thing happened? Oh, and you're like, what happened when you all ordered Mexican food? When was this? You know what I mean? And you're trying to put the time frame together, and somebody kind of mentions something to give. Oh, this must be August of 1969. So they're talking about very, 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 because they're all so close. They have kind of a language and a code that they use that's so natural. And I think that's what, as I was listening back to it, I said, I listened to it the first time in 10 years. That's the first thing I remembered that came back to me was, they have a language and rhythm together that even though they hadn't been together as an ensemble cast for, at that point, 20, 30 years, whatever it was, instantly came back, just instantly happened. And the more they got into the day, at least from the LA side of things, and again, the wonderful Darren Gross was directing. Shout out to Darren, who just did an amazing, amazing job. Just amazing job. Unsung hero here.
Because I mean, one of the other things, just to pick up on that, this decision that I'd made that we would do a lot of discontinuous recording to spread the cast further made it immensely complicated, because you'd actually be doing it like you'd be doing like episodic TV is done today, where you're recording people in character groups. They weren't necessarily scheduled in chronological order. And so bear in mind, we worked the cast pretty hard. Doing, a dramatic reading in a day that's still an hour of recorded material from beginning to end. That's a hell of a lot. That's more than they did on the original Dark Shadows. Let's just point that out. So we were asking an awful lot of those actors, and from a director of our directors, of really everyone's job becomes hard. Everyone needs to kind of know their stuff more. You can't sort of turn up and, say the dramatic readings, naming no names. I think people worked out quite quickly, if they had the gist of it before they came in the studio, they didn't necessarily need to do a huge amount of preparation, because it's a back and forth story. It's all in order. It will unfold, and actors, good actors can judge the rhythm of that as they go. Whereas with this, it was an awful lot of, again, to make it recordable, a lot of 1 and 2 page scenes.
Yeah.
And if you're not careful, they can just sound out of context meaningless, because it's sort of people running into rooms saying, but now this has happened, what's happened, this has happened, we must go and do something about it. Yes, we must. And they run out of the room. And it just means, when you know what happens both sides of it, it will make sense. But I think so. There were things like that were real kind of, they were walls to climb, and it was a very different kind of beast. It was a lot more, it was more demanding. I mean, as much as there was a lot of bonhomie, and I think it was a good time, and people enjoyed it. It was also really gritty work.
I'm sure it was
kind of hard. I remember David Selby saying to me afterwards that I enjoyed that, but yeah, that was hard.
Yeah. How was it?
Taken.
How was it with the two of you? Did you take turns writing scenes, or did you each take an episode and handle that, or was it just kind of back and forth, emailing the script to each other?
Well, this is the other thing that is also what I talk about challenges. Now the world is, the communication of the world is caught up that it doesn't really matter. I'm in London, and you're in LA, and where are you? You're
in LA. Yeah.
None of that matters now. Whereas with the thing that would just trip us up continually, it wasn't big things. It was little communication things, just making sure everyone knew the same things. Everyone was on the same page, and it didn't seem to matter how many times you do that. So we were sort of feeling our way into this world and trying to get. And from my point of view as a producer, it was always about trying to get that model to work, and we never entirely cracked it. We got things working somewhat better. But one of the things Eric and I did that was kind of space age at the time, we did do some Zoom meetings. They weren't, it was audio, not. Was it Zoom or something else?
I thought we did Skype. Right?
Skype. It must have been Skype.
Yeah, we did Skype.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
But we were sort of doing proto conferencing for this. And so we did talk through ideas, and then we wrote outlines, and there was back and forth and hammering out. Then the individual scripts are pretty much as credited. But it was all about, the hardest thing with all this stuff was always communication. So really, again, having one writer, having someone who's simpatico, and and also having sort of territory. So Eric had those 2 episodes, and particularly the third one is really a bottle episode that was his entirely in conception. That seemed to make it work.
Who doesn't like a dance, right? Who doesn't like everyone getting together for a dance?
And then experiencing their worst years. That was really cool. That was super cool. I want to get to that. I love that. And just the opening of this thing, I mean, I love, you had to continue it on from where it left off. And I love that you did it sort of as a 4-part serialized story. It does, I mean, that's perfect for Dark Shadows. It's kind of, that adds to it. But there's more to it than that. I think capturing the tone, the mood, and just the characters themselves, the way they speak and the way they behave, I feel like you guys nailed it, because I think in a lot of licensed Dark Shadows stuff, there's a tendency to make Barnabas is like this tragic superhero, which he can be at times, but you have the gray areas worked into Barnabas here. You have Angelique as more than just, in a lot of licensed media, she's like this kind of one-dimensional revenge machine. She's more nuanced, as she was in the show. Yes, Angelique does some really bad stuff, but there are other elements to Angelique there that are not all one-dimensional. And Quentin, you've kind of restored Quentin here to, Quentin's going to do what Quentin's going to do to make sure Quentin's okay. So, and he does, and you kind of bring him back into that Quentin that we all loved in 1897. Capturing those characters, I think those big 3 there, we mentioned Julia at the end, but those are the big 3, the Barnabas, Quentin, and Angelique, as far as association with Dark Shadows and pop culture. You really captured them. Was that a challenge? I'll start with Eric and then Stuart. Like what? How did you capture their voices? Was listening to those audio tapes, did you hear them in your head when you were writing this?
Yeah, I literally went back before diving into this. Unlike, I didn't really do it for Wicked and the Dead, which was kind of a more vomit thing. This is the story I always wanted to write. I went back and just watched a ton of Dark Shadows, to be honest with you, to just really lock down character voice and really get it in my head. Picking, I didn't have time to watch obviously 1,200 episodes, but picking groups of 5 or 10 of my favorite storylines across 5 years to kind of really refresh my memory. And I remember thinking, oh, for example, with Maggie's very strong. She's always
Yes.
sometimes,
I was
she
gonna
can
get to
always
her.
sometimes,
Yeah.
in my opinion, be written too softly. And Kathryn's such a powerful actress that one of my favorite moments in Kingdom of the Dead is towards the end, where she kind of is telling Barnabas off. And
Totally.
there are also moments between her and Willie. And I remember thinking, yeah, if this is, I don't know when this is in the Dark Shadows timeline, but is there a world where Willie and Maggie they're going to hook up at some
You're
point?
kind of shipping the Maggie and Willie thing.
Yeah, this is,
Yeah.
and then I remember watching the 68 episodes where
Yes.
there are moments where John Karlen and Kathryn as actors have a few scenes together that are more unusual than how they would have been in the black and white, say, episodes or later on. I remember trying to consciously tap into that and pull that out and put that in Kingdom of the Dead. You know, and because I don't consider anybody, I know pop culture in general considers Dark Shadows to be Barnabas, Angelique, Josette, Quentin. That it's never been that for me. Yes, I love him to death, but I love the Trasks. I love Willie.
Oh, me too. Absolutely.
I love all of these characters as much. Barnabas accepted, obviously. That's the only thing I will say. That's a whole special thing, but I love all of these characters so much. So I always want, when we were going through this, and I think Stuart and I probably talked about this in some of our exchanges, was, hey, how do we make sure that the people who are not named Barnabas, Angelique, and Quentin get equally strong moments and equally strong scenes throughout?
Yeah.
And some laughs too, even sometimes throughout the stories. I knew that was important to me. And that's an example of something that Stuart and I really agreed on. And it was unexpected, and it bonded us together as writers because we have very different styles. He's, if I may be so bold as to say from my point of view, Stuart is very poetic, very languid, very ethereal, right? And very, 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 I don't know if that's English or not, but I'm coming from the American, and I'm the brash American. When can the werewolf bite somebody? Right? when can somebody like scream and do an exorcism or something like that, and then wrap it into emotion? Obviously.
Well, I think in a lot of things, like Quentin's the werewolf, but he was a lot more than that, and you really you captured that. But you mentioned I want to get to Stuart too in terms of these characters and writing these characters and capturing their voices, but just you mentioned Maggie and Willie, which I was going to get to them. I love that subplot in 1968 where Maggie starts to remember what Barnabas did to her, and Willie's like, oh my God, and he's keeping her in the mausoleum because he's like, what am I going to do? It's beautiful. It's like black box theater. It's just fantastic. Just this intense scene, these intense scenes between the two of them as her memories are coming back and she realizes what Barnabas did. And you guys brought that back, which I loved, because in the show, Barnabas never, and I think people tend to be too forgiving of Barnabas sometimes. I love Barnabas. He's my favorite fictional character of all time. Barnabas, there's some pretty messed up stuff in the show all the way through, not just during that time. And that particular thing was horrific, what he did to Maggie, and Nicholas Blair wipes her memory and she doesn't remember it and he never has to answer for it. I love that you kind of held him accountable a bit for that. And then we see what Barnabas does, what Barnabas is going to do when he realizes that Maggie remembers and she's clearly upset about it and Willie's taking her side. He's going to kill Maggie. And it's like, wow, this is awful. But it's what Barnabas resorts to when he's cornered like that. And then Maggie kind of confronting him and saying, you have to leave town. That's the only way I'll let this go, is you have to leave so you don't hurt anybody else and go deal with this. Kathryn Leigh Scott was great at playing Maggie. She was a very strong character. Maggie Evans always had a lot of moxie and she had a backbone and she was great. And you captured that as well. Again, another instance where you really captured the character's voice. Stuart, how about you in terms of capturing these characters' voices and working them into?
My trick, if it's a trick, I would basically sort of work out what the rhythm of the scene was, what the energy of it was, and I would find a Bob Cobert track
Mm-hmm.
and I would write to that on a loop. So I would have that would give you the pace of the
Right.
speech, sort of write to
Mm-hmm.
that. And I would do I have to do the voices. That's the only way I can sort of, that's my sort of litmus test. I mean, I'm not gonna do them for you, but I find you have to read
I
it
was
out
going to
and
ask if
you
you.
have to do the voices and you have to sort of have the poise because the wrongness in the vocabulary and the attitude, it just kind of suddenly leaps out in a way that on the page it can kind of hide. The minute you actually try and do your best Jonathan Frid, and suddenly you realize, oh, you can never say that word. You just never say that word in a million years. So
Totally.
that sort of side of it was important to me. And then I guess the other side of it was one of the things I do remember us doing during the sort of development was we did talk about the characters quite holistically. I'm not sure that's the right word, but rather than sort of talking about what they would do, it was more like a to-do list of where we wanted them to get to. And
Mm-hmm.
Maggie and Willie were very central to that, I
Yeah.
remember. Because one of the things I'd been a bit irked by, there was a couple of people reviewing the first series who sort of made a comment they felt Maggie should be more gutsy and go get them. And they seemed to be just sort of saying, well, it's the 2000s. You can't write a woman be scared of a vampire. She should be like Buffy and I don't know, kick the bejesus out of Barnabas or stake him. And that really irritated me because I sort of felt that was like, no, you were completely wrong about this because it actually the thing that's cherishable about characters like Maggie and Willie in the bandwidth of Dark Shadows, they are about as near to relatable people in that regular cast as we can get.
Mm-hmm.
Their experiences aren't relatable, but they are they're our kind of real people, and so you don't make them into superheroes. And so what I wanted to do, particularly with Maggie, was find a way we could address that story in 67 stroke 68 and let her have agency and let her win in a in a non-violent, non-physical way. And actually the way she does it, and I think it is of the writing, certainly I did, I think it's one of my favorite scenes I wrote, is the one at the end where you know, she defeats him through her humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She tells him that. And I sort of liked also the ambivalence of realizing she couldn't be a sort of superhero and defeat him, but she could at least save and look after the people in her immediate sphere.
Which is
And
what
that,
Maggie would do. Yeah.
yeah, and that to me just felt like, well, that's a way you can do it. That's a way you can have Maggie be powerful on her own terms and not
Mhm.
turn her into something else. So that was
Yeah.
very important.
And you had, Willie siding with Maggie against Barnabas and, helping Maggie, which Willie would do. I mean, that was the one, Barnabas had control over Willie, but when it came to Maggie, and other people at Collinwood, Willie would try to resist that and protect those people, especially
And
Maggie.
Jon Karlen really was great at that because
Yes.
the thing he was wonderful at was, Willie is a coward. He's terrified of everything. And so
Yeah.
something like that, trying to be brave, is far more impactful than, someone who has actual moxie.
And he said, "I was your slave. I buried bodies for you." It's just sort of
Well, that came from Jon Karlen.
Really? Oh,
I
yeah.
interviewed him when we did the first series. One of the things I went out there for the first year, and one of the things I had to do was make a behind the scenes CD while I was there. So there was a little room at the back of the studio. Take people into this tiny room that was like a sort of brick covered, and we'd sit sort of like nose to nose almost, and I'd interview them because it was the only quiet space in the studio that wasn't a studio.
Mhm.
And I remember interviewing Jon Karlen. He was really interesting because one of the things I asked him was, at this point, are Barnabas and Willie friends? And I thought he'd sort of say, yeah, I guess they've reached it. And he was really adamant. He said, no, these two men are not friends. And I remember he said, Willie has buried bodies for this man. You can't negate that and call this friendship. I'm pretty sure that is a verbatim quote. And I think that's more or less transcribed into the dialogue, because I just thought, oh wow, that's just, someone presents you a moment like that, and it's John Karlen looking you down the eye with the
it's
thoughts
a
of
great
God.
moment. It's a great
I
moment.
was just like, yeah, wow, that has to be on mic. So yeah, that's all credit to John, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, Barnabas in those 67 episodes is sending Willie out to do this job. I mean, I was in an interview with Jon Karlen early on, one of those shadow cons where he talked about that. Somebody asked him, so I was bringing him animals and then bringing him people, young ladies, he said, and presumably was burying the bodies as well. This is the kind of stuff that was implied that they couldn't really show at that time, but these great dynamics that were developed in this story. For example, another one that I really liked was an unexpected one, but really makes sense and was kind of cool when you have Barnabas and Quentin in this sort of Seraph's sort of netherworld and the kingdom of the dead. And Angelique shows up to get Barnabas out. She was there to get them out, but it's like if you have to pick one, she picks Barnabas, and they ditch Quentin and they leave him there, which is terrible, but they do it. And then you have this whole dynamic that develops with Angelique and Barnabas versus Quentin, which is kind of fascinating, too. The Barnabas and Angelique become these kind of reluctant allies in a way. And that was interesting, too. And then Quentin, of course, does what Quentin does. He gets out of the situation and then he manages to come back, but he makes a really awful bargain with Seraph. That's kind of, the story kind of hangs on that a lot, too, with Seraph coming back. Thoughts on any of that whole storyline?
For me, channeling into those kinds of character dynamics, I feel that that's done very strongly in the 1897 storyline.
Yes.
That and so in those, that because that all happens at the end of part one, and so Stuart's like, "Hey, part two, that's you now." Okay, run with it, my man. I'm like, okay, they're enemies now. I had to really kind of gleefully tap into that 1897 dynamic where you never know who's your full friend.
It's totally true. It's very Dark Shadows, I think. It's just
it's very Dark Shadows. So to me, it felt right on brand of the show, of the original series, but then we're just doing a different version of it, which is what gave it an updated feel to it. At least that's what I felt I was doing in those particular episodes. Plus, it's always good to see two really strong friends, Barnabas and Quentin, who had been friends for so long, put them at odds, and they don't want to be at odds with each other. And we know eventually, because it's storytelling, that they are going to get back together in some capacity. It's just going to take 3 episodes for it to do.
Right.
And to me, it leads to the end of part 3 when Quentin says something to the effect of, "I just turned into a werewolf, and oh God, I enjoyed it."
Yes, that was fascinating too. That was really interesting. And you had that, that whole scene in the
That to me sums up the inherent contradiction with supernatural characters on Dark Shadows. They're human beings who sometimes have these incredible superpowers to do really wild things, but what it does to them is make them less than human. And that's a direct contradiction. Sure. Because being able to turn into a bat, fly around, turn into mist, go through walls, have the strength of a werewolf, being able to have witchy powers or warlock powers to make people forget stuff, I'd love to have all those powers. That would be awesome. However, if every time I use them, I become a little less human, what price am I paying? That's a central, at least for me, a central theme that runs through Dark Shadows. And that's the kind of thing that Stuart and I would be talking about on our Skypes.
Yeah. It's perfect.
And he's 3 a.m. and I'm whatever, 5 p.m, and then vice versa. It's 8 a.m. for me, and it was crazy. It was crazy, but fun crazy.
I also love that Maggie interjects during this whole scene where Barnabas, Angelique, and Quentin kind of go off over here and they discuss how they're going to deal with this situation, and everybody else is kind of over here, and she's like, "That's what they always do. They go and they who knows what they're talking about? Only they understand what they're talking. But we're left out of it." And that is sadly kind of in a way what happened to a lot of the human characters on Dark Shadows. They kind of became background players to these sort of dark god characters that were interacting, but Maggie acknowledges that and comments on it, which I thought was interesting. And then Angelique does this great incantation. You brought in an Angelique incantation, which I thought was really cool. That whole sequence I thought was fantastic too. And I want to talk about, that's going to lead me to, I love that you brought in for this not only original cast members from Dark Shadows, but you brought in one of the 91 Dark Shadows cast members, Lysette Anthony, as Dr. Rankin, the other villain in this, the other antagonist in this, who runs Wyncliffe's taken over Wyncliffe.
Who's terrific.
She was great. Yeah, she was.
Oh
great.
My goodness, she's phenomenal. You know, and just when you think she's gone in part 2, surprise,
she's there. Yeah, she's still there. It's so cool, so cool. And then you brought in Alec Newman from the 2004 unaired WB pilot, and we find out, you know, carries this orderly at Wyncliffe who's under the control of Dr. Rankin, but then you find out he's David. It's David Collins who has returned to Collinwood, returned to the Dark Shadows universe, and you Alec Newman playing that role. He was excellent as David Collins. I mean, just really an adult David. He even kind of, like, if they ever did a live action version out of David Hennessy wouldn't do it, Alec Newman would be a good David Collins. I mean, he was great. How did all of that come about? Was that intentional, like casting Dark Shadows cast members from other versions of Dark Shadows, or did it just work out that way?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it might. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I kind of like the idea we could have people from different versions of Dark Shadows. I never saw that as being like a dividing line.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think now. I can't remember. I do remember David coming back. That was definitely Eric's idea because, as I say, as I mapped it out, it was Karlen, and she was going to be the character that became Dr. Rankin was more her sort of henchwoman. It was going to be the kind of sort of almost like sort of teacher's pets, stroke playground bully, but she'd be like a sort of senior nurse at Wyncliffe, sort of nurse practitioner kind of style. And what it really came down to was it just wasn't going to be able to work. We just couldn't really make it work doing the amount of material we'd have needed with Nancy Barrett, who was then in New York, just wasn't shaking out.
Mm-hmm.
And then Eric had this idea, well, what if it was David? And I had done 2 dramatic readings with Alec Newman the year before, and I really liked him, and he really liked the stuff we did with him. He liked the scripts. But yes, and that was sort of instantaneous. It was like the minute Eric said, it could be David, and I was just like, oh, it could be Alec. Alec could do that. That's just perfect. It just seemed there was no thought necessary. I was such a no-brainer piece of casting because, as you say, he kind of looks like David Hennessy, and he could do a really good American accent because he'd been working in LA for several years, and he was just amazing. And so that was just like, oh, and again, it was sort of like you're all sort of looking for footholds in a story this big. You know, what's a bit I can latch onto and we can kind of clamber up the wall a bit more. And it just felt that just opened up real possibilities. The idea we could make it much more multi-generational.
Yeah.
And it was that, again, that's more soapy.
Do you think Alec watched the David Hennessy's performance to get a feel for the cadence of the character? Because he kind of captured that. I don't know. He sounded like David. It worked.
I don't believe he did. I mean, I was aware I heard him do an American accent, and I kind of knew what he sounded like. But I really can't praise him enough. Having directed him a couple of times, he's just such an amazing, intuitive actor. I remember in the first dramatic reading we gave him, he's this character who has got a Scottish accent. He plays the Ghost Watcher, and he's like this sort of swashbuckling character, and we let him do it with his own accent. He's kind of great. And I'd written in the script at the end, there's a sort of for story reasons, he's revealed that's not who he is. And I'd written in the script, and it's a terrible stage direction. Over the course of this speech, it's about 2 or 3 sentences, the accent fades away. Now, that's just an idiotic thing to put in a script. How the hell can you perform it? And he did it like that on the first take.
Wow.
It was incredible. It was just an amazing piece of acting. And so I kind of knew he could do anything. And I just thought, that would be knockout. And with Lysette, she had done some Big Finish, some Doctor Who. Lysette had also done a UK soap, which was kind of a Twin Peaks knockoff called Night and Day, which was kind of campy and a bit, much closer to a sort of modern Dark Shadows in a real sense. Google it; it's on some of it's on YouTube. But I sort of thought, yeah, she could channel her in a Grayson Hall. She's got that in her. A lot of her screen work, you wouldn't get that sense from. And she really did. I remember she sent me an email afterwards saying that was a hoot and a half.
Yeah, no, she was great. We brought in Wincliffe and this whole sequence of events, and then we bring back David. And I love that whole, I mentioned this to Eric when we were at Dark Shadows Remembrance Weekend. I love that whole sequence where everyone is experiencing their worst fears. Like Barnabas sees a body that's drained of blood with the fang marks, and earlier Quentin had seen a body torn apart at Collinwood by a werewolf. And David's worst fear is the phone, the old candlestick telephone shows up and it starts ringing. He's like, oh no, oh my God, no. And he answers, don't answer it. And he answers it, and you hear Quentin's theme playing. He says, hello, David, it's Quentin. We're going to play the game as if I'd never left. And it's like, he's still afraid. Barnabas is like, it's you, Quentin, it's you. He said, oh, he's still afraid after all these years. I remember the first time I listened to that, I got goosebumps because of course that's David's worst fear. That's perfect. That you nailed that. What made you think to do that? Was that your idea, Eric, or was it yours?
Yeah, that's probably something.
Well, the thing I kind of liked about us bringing back David, and again, I say it opened up possibilities that bringing Karlen back didn't.
Yeah.
And one of the things I sort of like, and I guess it gets developed more as the story goes on, particularly in the last part, is you've got this guy who is to all intents and purposes an adult, but in a lot of ways is a very damaged child, and
totally,
behaves in a very different way and can be sort of reckless and quite dangerous. And that to me just seemed really, really interesting. That was just in the minute. That third episode was great because it did allow us to sort of do a handy sort of checklist of people's psychological hang-ups and where they're at. But these are, it's, joking aside, they're very damaged individuals. And that's the thing that makes them kind of endlessly fascinating, particularly in combination.
Absolutely. They're all damaged, all of them. And David in particular, I mean, from day one, David is clearly, he's a disturbed child. And then he goes through all kinds of, and we love David, but he's all of them. They've all been through some horrific things.
Yeah, it's funny. One of, I don't know if it's a trick or anything, Stuart would identify with this, but sometimes in approaching certain characters, you have certain kind of thematic approaches that run through your mind. And for me, when I hit upon something, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it was true for me, is writing David was, when I think about the show, even though David is a child, he always acts like an adult. He was always, to me, the most grown-up person on the show as a child. So it must be the opposite now that he has grown up. He's going to revert to the selfish nature of being a child. And that's what allows him to make that switch. That's what sets up the ending in part 4.
Totally,
Stuart did so brilliantly, where you realize, oh my God, David's just as bad. In fact, he's way worse because he's a child in the body of an adult. With the abilities of an adult, the desires, wants, all the foibles of being an adult. So that was running through my mind, writing David all the time in those middle things. And I think Stuart then just, again, that's meeting of the minds. He just ran with it even more and did a great conclusion of it in part 4, which I loved.
It's great. Yeah. Because Quentin, of course, his deal that he makes with Sarah, when Angelique and Barnabas leave Quentin in the kingdom of the dead, he makes a deal with Seraph that he has to murder an innocent person. He has to sacrifice an innocent in order to be free and free himself from being stuck taking over the kingdom of the dead, and also freeing Seraph and bringing Seraph to the earth. So Quentin can't go through with it. He can't. He says, I've killed before, but he can't. He's drinking. He's listening to his music and drinking, which is what Quentin does. And so David takes matters into his own hands. He goes to Angelique, because I remember you when you were Cassandra, and she tells him what needs to happen. And so he sends Susan Griffin, who who was played by Ursula. Gosh, I can't remember. Ursula Burton. Ursula Burton played Susan Griffin.
She's fantastic, by the way.
She was very good. Yeah. And Ed Griffin was
good.
Jameson Selby, David Selby's son. And so he sends Susan off to her doom. And Quentin calls him on. He says, you're just as bad as all the rest of us. You know what you just did. It's terrible what you just did. But David's like, well, she's not a Colin. She's an it is a selfish move on David's part. And
it's a classist move as well. It's one of the other things. Like, we didn't really have the space to get into, but one of the things I also thought was kind of interesting is David coming of age is, he's a rich man with the privilege of.
There's a little Roger in there. There's a little bit of Roger in there. Yeah.
I know, absolutely. And I thought that was, again, we never really did the class stuff as much as possibly we should have. But I remember, that just felt, I just kind of like that. There's a sort of selfishness that I think goes beyond the immediate need. That again, you sort of throws things in sometimes because they feel interesting or right. And I think that was David. It was interesting feeling our way through David because he was kind of obviously he was a blank slate. We could really do what we liked with him because we had a passage of time and we were reintroducing him as a sort of surprise. But I think when it came to writing it, it didn't need an awful lot of thinking about. The character actually is really robust. He's really fit for purpose. So just sort of moving him on a few years, he seemed to quite naturally be there. You didn't really have to hunt for him.
And they kept him on for subsequent Big Finish audio dramas as a central figure there. The other thing I really like too is when we last saw Angelique and Barnabas in the show in 1840, Barnabas realizes he loves Angelique and she dies. But now they're back together here in this sequence of events, and she's still obsessed with Barnabas, but now he can't do it. He can't say I love you. He says I can't. I love Josette. He still loves Josette. So it's that it kind of goes back to that old dynamic. Angelique and Barnabas are always going to implode. They're kind of almost two sides of the same coin in a lot of ways. I love them as allies as much as I love them as adversaries. They work very well together, and that was a whole cool dynamic. And it was kind of heartbreaking too, because Barnabas just can't. At the end there, Angelique, it's like that's all she wants, is for Barnabas to say he loves her. He can't do it.
I think Barnabas has a real, and again, you mentioned this earlier, the flaws of Barnabas, not just the good stuff. He can be very cruel, very emotionally cruel, not just beating Willie with a cane. And it's not lost upon me that the male protagonist is reborn in a younger, sexy body, comes back, and then decides, I can do whatever I want, and I don't necessarily love you the way I perhaps would have. It's a sub-theme underneath that's very entitled and cruel and, unfortunately, I think very human. At least that's how I'm reading it a little bit. And it makes him that's one of those, you're a vampire, but you're also very human, because this is weird. This is a little off color. We saw you say these things in 840 and they felt very genuine. Right. 1840 being my favorite storyline. Which drives Stuart up the wall. But it's the truth. It's the truth. And it's how do you reconcile that in Kingdom of the Dead? How do you bring it kind of full circle?
Right.
I felt we were able to do that because of the rebirth. It was almost he conveniently forgot everything that happened in the last season of Dark Shadows because he had been given this second chance, which I think people tend to do,
right?
In real life.
But at the same time, he's a deeply flawed character. Barnabas thinks he's doing the right thing, but
he does.
The way I always reconciled it was, I think Barnabas sincerely believes in what he's doing in the moment. He says to Angelique in that moment, and circumstances are conducive, and she's dying, and he won't have to really live with it for very long. Yes, I love you. And I think he sincerely believed that in the moment. In a world where, as you say, he is seeing things through new eyes. Maggie is back, who he thought was gone for good.
Yeah.
All bets are off. And I kind of liked, one of the things I did like, and again, I don't know if we ever reference it directly, but Angelique's kind of got something she's always wanted. She's watched Barnabas plotting with Julia on the sidelines all these years, and she gets to be that person.
Yes,
and it's actually horrible, it's not fulfilling, and goes through that all that sort of tacit rejection, as Eric says, emotional cruelty that Julia did. And I sort of love that. I really like the idea that Barnabas is I don't buy that Barnabas is a sort of reluctant vampire. I think he's a terrible person who thinks he's a reluctant vampire, which is far more interesting. He's an erotic vampire. He's not a reluctant one.
He's complicated, and that's how Frid liked to play him. He liked to play Barnabas as in these shades of gray areas. And at the same time, he does, he stands against Seraph. He tries to save everyone, which Barnabas does try to do. It's just the way he goes about it a lot of times is questionable from a moral standpoint.
Well, look who got it. Poor Susan. Come on.
Yeah,
and Stuart's still bummed about that.
And why is it, whose fault is it? As always, it's we go back to, it's like, oh wait, it was kind of Barnabas and Quentin's fault to begin with that this all happened, as is often the case. Talking about some of these other characters, Isaiah Trask, which was a great way to use Jerry Lacy, a previously unknown Trask descendant, because at first we have this, this sort of feeble kind of, reminds me of the caretaker, the old caretaker from 1967, who was Daniel Keyes, who was fantastic. But it turns out he's actually a Trask. It's in his blood. Seraph brings out the Trask in him, and in all his fire and brimstone glory, he comes back, this new version of Trask. So Jerry Lacy, as always, was amazing. Any thoughts on him?
Yeah, and that was one of the few things that was mapped out before. I like this idea of we'd have this sweet old guy who would then turn into the fire and brimstone Trask, because I don't know how either of you felt, but I felt whenever they put Jerry, they had Jerry as Trask the butler, and you're sort of there like, this is all very well, but when's he going to start doing some preaching or
exorcism or something?
Burning some crosses. Come on. And so I felt that maybe it was playing with that expectation, but I also thought that it was just much more fun. Again, the story, it wasn't a sort of story that was developed in a sort of beginning, middle, end way. I was trying to think of, well, what are going to be great moments, and those kind of, that sort of, I guess it's almost a sort of triple cliffhanger on the second one. It was sort of cross-cutting, and
there was,
I love that stuff. I love that it's again, it's sort of it's firing off. It's like synapses firing off. It's got you can see the sort of paths lighting up, and
and it makes you excited for the next installment.
Yeah, and that's really sort of soapy. That's not if we were doing if we were doing it in the format we'd done the previous years. Those kind of pieces of connective tissue are sort of so low frequency, they're barely there. Whereas here, they're actually, I think, a lot more important than the story to speak of. And I'm not saying that in a glib way, but I think that's true of Dark Shadows, as a series. I think the journey is much more exciting than the destination. Very few Dark Shadows stories really end particularly well.
Kill everyone and go to the next story.
You killed. No, I did. I mean, I remember joking about that when we did the first series. I was like, well, clear. There's only two ways you can end a Dark Shadow story: you kill it, or you set it on fire.
Yeah. Yes.
Possibly both.
It's how you end a Roger Corman Poe cycle film too. Burn the house down.
Yeah. With the same footage 3 times in 3
totally.
movies in a row.
Yes. Yep. A couple of other characters. James Storm, you brought back as Sheriff Haggerty. I don't know if this was intentional. I appreciate the naming convention. Three syllables: Patterson, Davenport, Haggerty. I don't know if that was intentional or not. I was like, oh, I wonder if they're kind of pulling from that just as a nod to the.
Stuart,
maybe it was like an unconscious thing that
was
came
that
out.
You?
No, I think it was intentional.
Yeah.
That's some of my favorite stuff in actually the whole episode. There's that sort of sub-strand in the third one.
Oh, with Lysette Anthony, with the doctor.
Well, it's sort of
it's the comedy, really.
Reverend Trask and Sheriff Haggerty and Ed Griffin. Like that was great. And it's just these 3 people who've got completely different voices and completely different intelligence levels and experience levels trying to have the same conversation, which without really being there really being an intentional joke in any of it. I just found that stuff incredibly funny. Love this bit where sort of Ed says, they're like, well,
were very
Sheriff, I don't know
interesting.
what it's like where you come from.
Yeah, very fun contrast between those characters for sure. Now you mentioned Karlen, who of course returns at the end of this, which was a great and exciting thing because Nancy hadn't done anything, I don't think, in the previous one. So this was Nancy Barrett's return.
She did a little bit in the Christmas one.
Okay. Yeah, it's been a while since I've listened to that.
Recorded at the Dark Shadows Festival that year, so I literally did it in a hotel room on a mini disc player.
Okay. I'd forgotten about that, but she does come back to play Karlen here. She meets Quentin at the train station. Everybody's leaving town at the end of this. Barnabas has to leave. I think in Quentin says, I'm getting out of here because of what David did. He said, I don't want to be around any of this. Quentin's going to leave, and he meets Karlen at the train station, and we have Nancy Barrett, who's sensational. And at some point, if she'll ever do it, I'd love to have Nancy on the podcast because I know she's very private, but it would be cool to. And you did a great interview with Nancy Stewart.
And Nancy's great.
Daytime Gothic. Great interview with Nancy.
Incredibly intelligent.
Yes.
Interesting, slightly mysterious.
Great actress, too. I mean, just character roles that she played on there. Fantastic.
Quietly very, very funny.
I'm sure, yeah.
I really liked her. It was great. Really good conversation. I mean, I don't know how it is written up, but it was, I really enjoyed that chat with her.
Yeah, it was really great. For those who haven't read it, it's Daytime Gothic issue 1, which we haven't gone to issue 2 yet, but I'm excited about that too. But we have Nancy Barrett come back as Karlen. She meets Quentin at the train station, and then she returns to Collinwood and reunites with David, which is a really great scene. Then we have the big cliffhanger where he asks her, do you have the box? Do you have the box? And she says, it's right here. She opens it, and it's the hand of Count Potoffi, and they both revel in the fact that they have the hand of Count Potoffi. I think they're both possessed by Potoffi. And actually, they did carry this on into the next, I think, when they did the next serialized story, which I don't think, at that point, I don't think you guys were involved in that, but it was David possessed by Potoffi in that building a mine under Collinwood or something to that effect. But I'm curious to hear about how did you come up with this ending, this big cliffhanger for this, and did you have thoughts on the direction you were going to go in with that versus what did go?
Okay, so originally there was a draft of that episode written that wrapped it all up very, very neatly.
Mm-hmm.
So Quentin goes off, and I think it was sort of a closing, a sort of reversal of the Vicky Winters monologue. Mm-hmm. And it was really going to wrap everything up in a kind of neat way with an idea we might pick up with a blank slate at some. And I just sort of felt, again, the rhythm of a soap is it doesn't quite end. And so you sort of got to the last episode, and I just thought, if this was a soap, as one story winds down, the next one gears up. So I wanted to just throw in some stuff that could point ahead to that, not really with a great expectation of where it might go. And so one of the things we were doing around that time was these dramatic readings, and we were doing one with Nancy Barrett and Marie Wallace in New York that Joe Salvatore directed. And I just sort of thought, well, maybe, what could we do that's 4 pages long that we could bolt onto the end of that session, and we could just get Nancy and Marie in somewhere. So we put in a little scene of her in the pub. And I'm trying to think. I think it actually was recorded. It was recorded before the actual scenes. There wasn't a version of those scenes recorded that didn't have that. So the stuff with Nancy and Marie actually may have been ended up being the very first thing recorded for Kingdom of the Dead.
Okay.
But I just wanted to throw in a little bit, like, this is the beginning of the next story. And
I forgot to mention Marie Wallace. Yeah, she was great too. Jessica.
Yeah, and again, it was sort of like, that sort of in a little way points towards Return to Collinwood.
Sure, yep.
Want to, if you want to see it, take it that way. And the Hand was just a bit like, well, all right, this is all very nice, but come on, this is Dark Shadows. What's the ridiculous cliffhanger? And it was sort of like, what's the most ridiculous thing I could set up between Karlen and David within a page? And I had been watching 1897. So, well, I brought the hand. I don't know. I just thought
Oh, it works. I mean, that's it totally works. I mean,
what is actually the most sort of ridiculous.
I guess were they under the control of Count Petofi though? That's my question. Were they acting under their own agency in that scene, or were they? I assume they were under the control.
Yeah, my take on it is that Karlen is completely possessed, and the minute she says to David, "I brought the hand," and opens the box, he is possessed, and you sort of hear it in the performances because
the age of Petofi. Yeah,
he starts because at that point he starts echoing her delivery.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Okay, gotcha. That's the one. That's the one. That's the one thing in the series that I'm.
It made me laugh so much. And
I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. When I re-listened to it, I was like, "Yay!" That's one big thing I think in the original series that was a big miss was that, and I assume if the show had kept going, they would have brought back Count Petofi. I mean, because he was such a memorable villain in the show, and it's kind of blows my mind that they didn't do it, that he didn't show up in the present at some point, and I suspect they would have done that, but it was a fun way to set that idea up.
Doesn't he show up in the present technically?
No. Oh, well, kind of
half an episode, right?
Yeah, through Quentin.
Through Quentin, he does get to the
he sees the newspaper and all of that. Yes, which is why you're right. Yeah, he does. He glimpses it, which gives.
Sometimes I think about Dark Shadows a little too much.
Don't we all? Don't we all? I was reading your bio online. Does your wife? Is she a Dark Shadows fan?
No, not at all. But she tolerates my love for it in amusing ways and has grown to love my love of it.
Wonderful.
I think that's the way to describe it. So if something Dark Shadows related happens and I'm not aware of it, she'll go, "Oh, I read here in the thing. There's it took a while. It took a while. You know.
She's a cheerleader for your fandom of Dark Shadows.
Yes.
Yeah, awesome.
Exactly.
I love that. Any other, before I have a couple of questions here that I want to throw out too that Stuart had brought up to me privately, and I want to address those. But does either one of you have anything else you want to say about Kingdom of the Dead, your memories of it, or any thoughts on it in general?
That's interesting. You both listened to it, and I've never re-listened to it since making it. So I remember I once met an actress from Prison Cell Block H, which is an Australian soap I love.
Oh, you mentioned that.
They just remade it as this show called Wentworth, and someone who was standing next to her asked her, "Have you watched Wentworth?" She goes, "I don't need to watch it. I lived it." And I kind of feel a bit like that about Kingdom of the Dead. I can kind of, I think I've got a pretty good handle on what was good in it, what didn't work. But mostly the thing I remember liking about it and the thing I hope holds true is it really has the rhythm and the energy and the sort of sensibilities of a kind of Heartland Dark Shadows story. And to sort of get that from a kind of concept to a reality was just really exciting. And I'm we were very lucky. We had a great writer, co-writer. We had an amazing, the cast are all great. Which doesn't always happen, but I think everyone we had is terrific in it. And it was just and Darren as a director did great work, and it was just a really good creative time. Hard, so gritty work, and sometimes really rough work. But yeah, I can sort of look back on it quite fondly.
Eric, how about you?
Yeah, I would echo what.
You disagree with everything.
No, not at all. I would agree with it.
It was sentimental.
It was a great time. I also never go back and rewatch or re-listen or reread stuff from the past that I've done. I just don't. And which is why I had not listened to this probably maybe even since 2010 or 2011. But I'm glad I did, because it did bring back a flood of primarily good memories of just the process working with Stuart. Again, Stuart and I think one of the greatest things that I enjoyed about the experience was working with another writer who had an equal passion for the show that I did, but is coming from a completely different, approach to things. I think that's the strength of the material. Sometime I used to make a joke. I remember this the first time I listened to it back in 2010, and it came back to me last weekend when I listened to it. I said, "Oh, that's right. Stuart likes echo more than I do." Every time characters talk at the beginning of an episode, it'll be hello, hello, hello.
Yeah.
It'll be dreamy, and my first line is going to be, "And they ripped your throat out." But I remember thinking, "Oh, that's right. That's why this works so well, because we're bringing our strengths and we're influencing each other." So I get a little more dreamy and ethereal, and he gets a little bit more tear out of tongue, that kind of thing. It's kind of nice,
Awesome. It's great. Well, if folks who haven't listened to it, you can, this is the CD. I'm sure well, I'll show the picture of it, but it's available on CD. It's a 4 CD set. I'm sure you can get it on Amazon or on the secondary market on eBay. I'm not sure. It might still be
well, I think. Is it on Spotify?
I'm sure you can get it from
Big Finish.
BigFinish.com.
BigFinish.com. Absolutely.
Get it directly.
I'm sure Big Finish. Yes, that should have been the first thing I mentioned. Big Finish. I'm sure has it available, probably streaming or on CD. It's well worth your time to listen to. I still want to see a Seraph meets Mr. Best episode, but that'll never happen at this point. Is Seraph meant to be like is he death or an angel, like the angel of death? Is that a distinct character from death?
The way I had it in my head, and again, you don't try to get too caught up in the technicalities of this, but I thought it was like a demarcation of labor thing. Mr. Best would be like agent in the field, and Seraph is kind of roaming boss.
I see. Gotcha.
Interesting. There's a lot of administration in the
it's just like hell. It's just like Diabolos with his.
Well, again, I was really I love that. That's so Dark Shadows, isn't it?
It totally is.
Angelique goes to hell, and asked to speak to the manager, and and he's a guy in a hood, but he's sitting at a desk.
Yes. Oh, I love it. So a couple of things unrelated things that I want to kind of touch on here a little bit. As you know, Stuart, I don't know if you had a chance to listen to it, Eric, but I did an episode on the end of Dark Shadows, and I talked to Mary O'Leary about the whole situation between Dan Curtis and Jonathan Frid, as well as several other factors that came into play, and Dan Curtis ultimately meeting with Brandon Stoddard and them pulling the plug on the show. But one other factor that plays into this that I didn't touch upon, I mentioned it in the last episode at the beginning, was the fact that Art Wallace sued Dan Curtis around the time House of Dark Shadows came out. And I think Dan settled out the lawsuit, from what I understand, with Art Wallace based on this interview that he did with Ed Gross back in 1986, Art Wallace. Any thoughts on that, Stuart? Because you reminded me of this.
Yeah, the thing I think is really interesting, I thought that was a fascinating episode, and I thought you laid out the landscape of all that very well.
Thanks.
Well, the thing I'd never really, I'm aware of it, I'd never fully joined the dots on, is I think there's clearly a tipping point where Dark Shadows goes from being this great catalyst in Dan Curtis's creative life to just being this source of endless stress. It's like it slips from his fingers. So he's riding high, and he's got this film made, and he's and the strange thing is that should be being the exec producer of a daytime drama, a 5-day-a-week one that runs all year round, is a full-time job. You're overseeing 250 plus half hours, and you don't stop. And simultaneously to that, though, Dan, from the minute Dark Shadows is up and running, is trying to get other things going. He's not content just to be making a soap. So his Jekyll and Hyde thing it gets delayed a little bit, but he's doing that in the spring of 1967. Dark Shadows has been running about 6 to 8 months at that point. And the year after that, he's trying to do his Dead of Night pilot. He's trying to get his Dark Shadows film off the ground simultaneously. He was buying literary properties. He bought this novel, Last of the Crazy People, which is a sort of not quite Manson family, but it's in that sort of oeuvre. And he was going to make that as a film. It was announced he was going to shoot it in October 1970 before he made Night of Dark Shadows, which had to really be done by April, to make its release date. It needed to have started by then. And suddenly you then flip to it's the end of 1970 and Crazy People has fallen to pieces for whatever reason. We don't know what happened there, but it was a sure thing and then it wasn't. Dan is making a Dark Shadows film in a couple of months. He hasn't got a script, let alone a storyline. Then he doesn't have a leading man. And then there's clearly some friction, and he doesn't have a leading man on his soap either. And I can just see all this playing out. And I think from Dan's point of view, the soap was, if you like, the most sensible thing to sacrifice. Because I kind of wonder, let's say, Dark Shadows had staggered on for another 13 weeks, and what would the show have been for the 6 weeks it would have taken to make Night of Dark Shadows? Who would have been the leads?
Yeah, because Jonathan would have been gone. Jonathan Selby,
would have been gone. Selby's your lead. Kate Jackson's your other lead.
Yeah. Lara's in it a lot.
Lara's going to be gone for a fair bit. John Karlen's gone for a fair bit. So is Nancy Barrett. So who are the leads of the show? Is it going to be
Liz and Roger?
Mary Cooper and Keith Prentice?
Keith Prentice.
Oh, no, sorry. I don't mean that to sound as cruel as it does, but I just don't think there was a viable show possible at a point where really what it would have needed was massive creative retooling.
Yeah.
And so I think for all those reasons, I think Dan very pragmatically looked at it and it made a lot of sense to get rid of Dark Shadows. There was simultaneously, there's a dispute over its ownership. And possibly, I don't know, but is it a coincidence that as this is happening, the show goes to 1840 and it suddenly is a show about a house called Collinwood and the title Dark Shadows, but otherwise there is nothing in it that could be traced back to that original Bible called Shadows in the Wall about Colin's house? I don't know. That may be a leap of speculation too far, so I wouldn't hold anyone to that. But I think it does illustrate the sort of assault from all fronts that Dan had. Right. And I think Dan there's an interesting interview with him in 1968. It's a kind of profile piece where the writer notes at the end, Dan Curtis seems like he might be getting bored of Dark Shadows or worse to that effect.
I've seen that article.
Well, I'll add some 2 cents to all this. Mm-hmm. And again, it's funny you should mention this because this is something Stuart and I talked about at Dark Shadows Remembrance Weekend. And I was unfamiliar with a lot of this. It was coming to me new about the legal case and whatnot, what was kind of going on behind the scenes. But I will say this, and I'll preface it by saying Dark Shadows and Doctor Who being my 2 favorite shows of all time. Mm-hmm. One thing that Doctor Who does really well is it changes its head producer, showrunner, whatever you want to call them, about every 3 to 4 years. Mm-hmm. Because in order to sustain a long story over many, many years, people do get burnt out. And it's hard to keep the excitement up. Or even if you're excited, it's hard to keep the people around you excited. Mm-hmm. Talking about practical experience now in my own career. I believe that it probably was a confluence of events, but I'm just wondering if perhaps when Dan went to go make the Dark Shadows movies, someone should have said to him, or he should have said, and again, this is my personal speculation, based on my own experience as a showrunner, it's time for you to go make the movies and somebody else needs to oversee the day-to-day show.
He would never do it.
And you need to appoint, and he would never, I get the impression that's something that he would not have done, but I also think that's what needed to be done.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's something that an ABC executive if a writer interviewing Dan can sense it, perhaps someone across the desk at ABC could lean in and go, "Hey, you seem a little burnt out on this. It's still your name. You've still created it. You'll still get royalties. You can make as many movies as you want. You keep the brand alive in your own way, but we're going to appoint a day-to-day point person to show run this."
Which would have been Leela Swift, but I think he saw it as his baby, and he wasn't.
I know.
There's no way Dan Curtis is going to hand the reins.
Also, there's an ancillary consideration from ABC's point of view that Dan had made this deal to make a Dark Shadows movie with MGM that ABC was not a beneficiary of, and which actively undermined the production of the show. And it's interesting. I mean, I guess it probably was tolerated with a degree of amusement, stroke bemusement, because it was so unprecedented.
Right.
But again, I could see if you're going to do that second time when you've got a rather depleted cast, ABC, and it's around negotiation time where really, even if it's a successful show, if you're an exec telling me you want another 26 weeks of Dark Shadows, I want to hear about your new big ideas for Dark Shadows.
Right.
You're going to be doing for my network, not the
movie. Yeah. Although I guess it would be free
we're going to have
advertising.
A skeleton cast twiddling their thumbs for 6 weeks. Right. I go away and I'll be Sam Peckinpah up in Tarrytown. I can see that being, as Eric said, I think you can, when your heart's in a different place creatively from the conversation you're having, that comes out.
One thing that Mary brought up that I thought was interesting too was that ABC wanted to cancel One Life to Live. That was the show that was on the table that they were kind of leaning toward canceling. And then Dan Curtis goes into this meeting with, presumably it was Brandon Stoddard, the head of daytime, and came out of that meeting with Dark Shadows being canceled. So the thing I'm wondering is, did Dan Curtis say, nah, go ahead and cancel Dark Shadows instead of One Life to Live? Or did he tell Brandon Stoddard, yeah, I fired Jonathan Frid? And Brandon Stoddard said, what? Are you crazy? Like, when you fired Jonathan Frid? I wonder what exactly was said in that.
Both. And I can see why, from Dan's point of view, it removes a lot of complication from his life. He's trying to make a film that he's hopelessly behind on. And he could then make the film on his own terms. He could schedule whoever the hell he liked.
Right.
And I think it was just in a life that was full of very complicated, different projects pulling in lots of different directions. I just can see how that made things a little bit more achievable at a time when he probably needed it.
Yeah, it makes sense.
As Eric says, the crazy thing is he just didn't get another show.
From what I know of Dan Curtis, I don't think he would have.
The only thing he
would have had to come from within. The Leela Swift, I think, is a perfect example. And
Leela had sort of become had taken that role in a de facto way, but she wasn't really given the free rein to actually make her mark on the thing, really, in the sense that there's an interview with her, one of her last interviews on tape, where she says the whole Bramwell thing was decided and presented to her as a fait accompli. She was not involved in it. There was no conversation. She was told, this is what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of tells you something about how that relationship was operating.
Right.
And, Leela was highly capable, highly driven. But again, I think had sort of she became producer almost by accident because she was the person there and it needed to carry on being made. And arguably, after Robert Costello left quite abruptly, Peter Miner really just went through the motions. He was kind of very much a hands-off line producer. He wasn't what Robert Costello was, which was when Dan would go away and make a pilot or go and do Jekyll and Hyde. Costello would run the show. He understood. He was an engaged creative producer, even though his remit was really line producer. And Dark Shadows probably needed that and probably needed one of those voices. And instead, it's sort of, I think they've been making do for a long time, and there's probably a limit to how much you can do that before that becomes exhausting and then overwhelming.
What was one thing, one other real quick, because we don't have a whole lot of time left. For years, I've always heard, Dan Curtis saved the tapes for Dark Shadows, and that's how we got Dark Shadows. But when we were talking in California, you pointed out that it wasn't Dan Curtis who saved the tapes; it was actually ABC, and then through World Vision distributing it, which I knew World Vision was was ABC, was World Vision basically, and they were distributing the show. But I had always heard, it's Dan Curtis saved the tapes, and that's why we still have Dark Shadows. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think this is something that most fans just kind of believe,
Yeah, so the minute Dark Shadows goes off the air in 71, very much early 71, within a couple of months, ABC are taking out trade ads saying ABC Films, I should say, which was their newly formed distribution division, were taking out trade ads offering it for syndication. Now, it took 4 or 5 years to get enough what do you call it, affiliates lined up to bring it to market, because I understand you need a certain concentration of in the marketplace to justify the costs of putting it in. Bear in mind there hadn't been long-term clearances, but between that and overseas sales, ABC was ahead of the curve, and so they were very interested in monetizing it, and that may have, because there are certainly lots of soaps that within a couple of years of going off the air were their tape, their archives were just lost. They'd just be scattered kinescopes and things like that. But ABC had an immediate incentive to hold on to this show. And as I understand it, ABC owned the physical tapes because they were provided by ABC infrastructure in the same way the studio facilities were, most of the crew, costume, all those kind of things. But Dan owned the intellectual property on them. So therefore, one could not be exploited. It could not be exploited without the consent of both parties. So it's a little more nuanced than that. But nonetheless, for whoever it had that idea that this was something that was marketable, that this could have, an afterlife, was incredibly bold thinking.
And that was ABC's.
That seems to have been ABC. ABC the thing you got to remember is ABC was a bit of an upstart operation, and they weren't like, it's not like the Universal Library or things like that where you have this huge reservoir of material. They had a relatively small number of properties available to them, and Dark Shadows was one that they saw. It had been merchandisable. It had been, it had been faddy, and it had been talked about in a way that, One Life to Live, or I don't know, Secret Storm. I don't know, Secret Storm. I don't think Secret Storm was on ABC, but you know what I mean. One of those shows was not going to be. So they were ambitious for it, and more power to them. That's why 60 years later, people are still streaming them.
Yeah. And we're talking about it right now. So then it was decided Dan owns the show itself, the intellectual property. So currently, ABC doesn't have a say in anything anymore, right? ABC is not involved in the process anymore in terms of new Dark Shadows.
ABC Films then became, even by the time Dark Shadows was in syndication, it became World Vision, a separate outlet, and it's since changed hands. I think it's now via CBS, which I guess would now mean it's Paramount. Those are distributed by, I don't know. I mean, everything is amalgamated and conglomerated at this point. But in terms of, they've come up with a pretty, given how logistically difficult it is to clear a soap opera for release and bring it to market after it's gone off the air. The afterlife Dark Shadows has had is extraordinary, and the fact it's still ongoing, I think it may outlast all of us.
Oh, sure, yeah. It does bum me out that the BBC they passed on Dark Shadows in the early 70s. Well, when we look at 70s Doctor Who, it looks Dark Shadows to me.
The thing I would say about that is the BBC were completely the wrong outlet for it. It should have been offered to ITV, which is the commercial network. They did 5-day-a-week soaps. The BBC did not. The BBC were not in the business of buying that many episodes of anything.
Gotcha.
They bought 26 episodes of Dark Shadows. What would that get you?
Yeah.
And they showed them 2 episodes from 1968. I have the document that went with the tapes that were sent somewhere here. I don't know where it is. But yeah, it's 2 like Dr. Lang.
They showed Dr. Lang episodes.
They sent them, which is not possibly the ones I'd have chosen, but yeah, they politely declined.
All right, guys. Well, hey, it was an absolute pleasure chatting with both of you. It was great talking with you. And I certainly look forward to talking to you in the future and hopefully seeing you guys at a future get-together at some point.
Yes. Thank you for having us. Thank you. And keep up the good work. Love your show.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And folks, thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please rate the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to the channel. That does help the podcast to grow and reach more Dark Shadows fans. So thank you for listening.
And for as long as they lived, the dark shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.